Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for coming to hear me. I do want to start by saying thanks to Vanderbilt University for inviting me to be the Drake Lecturer in 2018. I'm very honoured and thrilled, and I have had a wonderful time in the honky tonks. But I'm still with you to concentrate my mind on what I know is a much more minority sport, 18th century studies. I want to extend special gratitude to Professor Vera Kuczynski and Professor Bridget Orr, both of whom have been very generous and thoughtful and supportive in making this trip possible, and also in their absence to thank Gina Poindexter and Anna Jones, who've helped to make the whole process very smooth in administering my visit. I do have a handout. Do please take one. There's loads of them here. It's quite a bumper handout, but I always think, you know, if you switch off or think your thoughts start to wander, at least you'll have a take-home item to think about. I think I may have, there are many more here. Okay. So my title is Being There, the Fiction of Presence in the 18th Century Theatre and Novel. One of your number, very early on, whilst I was here, said to me, "What do you mean by fiction?" and that was a really insightful question, actually. It's a difficult question. I think that we're all more difficult than it appears. One of the core arguments that I have been trying to make about the theatre and the novel is to recognise that theatre is also a form of fiction, that it's a form of invented story. And that our obsession with printed prose fiction and with the rise of the novel has rather obscured the fact that, if you like, I would want to argue that in the 18th century, the theatre is the primary medium for story. And that the novel is, in a way, a kind of new competitor, which is struggling to find its place in relationship to that dominance. And that's a lot of this talk focuses on that issue. So the talk, as you can see from your handout, falls into 4 parts. I will talk about introducing theatrical presence. I'm going to then talk about, talk you through some ideas around presence, some more theoretical ideas about the elusiveness of presence. Turn to thinking about the way in which presence of mind is central to these 18th century modes, and finally turn to an idea about the aesthetics of what I call the aesthetics of real presence. On the final page, you have a summary of the draft of the book as it currently stands, if you want to refer to that. But I want to start, as we so often do in literary studies, with an anecdote from a novel. This is a novel by Frances Brooke called The Excursion, published in 1777. Maria Villiers, the heroine of that novel, who's an aspiring playwright and a country girl, has spent a whole month in London without yet attending a play. She attends a performance of Jephson's Braganza, which is a tragedy about 15th century Portugal. It's at Drury Lane, and she has a stage box, so she's sitting at the side of the stage, which shows her off to advantage. Maria, we're told, was absorbed in expectation. She forgot herself. She thought of nothing but the entertainment she was going to receive. It's a very familiar moment, actually, in the 18th century novel, a moment when a young woman is preoccupied with what's happening on the stage, but is visible to spectators of the theatre. Her special anticipation is reserved for the admirable actress who is to play the principal character, the Duchess Louisa. Louisa heroically resists the violent threats of the rebels in the final act of this tragedy. And if you know your theatre history, you'll probably know that close personal friend of the author of this novel, Frances Brooke, a woman called Marianne Yates, was famous for playing this part, playing the Duchess Louisa. So Frances Brooke is also sort of inscribing her own experience of seeing Frances Yates. So, first quote on the handout, and I am starting, where am I? Halfway down. The last scene arrived. The last scene arrived, the distress rose, the great actress whom Maria had so eagerly expected pierced the veil which the languid power of declamation had thrown round her. She burst forth in a blaze which aroused every dormant spark of sensibility, even in the most inattentive of her auditors. Filled with the noblest enthusiasm, the divine fire of genius, she appeared almost more than mortal. It was Louisa herself, the indignant queen, the tender wife, the steady heroine, the generous victim to the happiness of her people. Her voice, her look, her attitude, the whole tableau was striking beyond description. But you must have heard her, grasping the tyrant's arm, pronounce, "Feel, do I shrink or tremble?" to form any adequate idea of the excellence of her performance. Every heart was chilled with terror, respiration was suspended through the whole house, the dagger seemed pointed at each particular bosom, and the shout of exultation on her breaking from the traitor, whose part was admirably sustained, also spoke the danger real. So Francis Brooke, playwright, theatre manager and novelist, here is describing that moment when a theatrical performance comes to life. Its audience not simply spectating, but inhabiting the same affective space as the actor. The collective shout of the audience speaks the danger real. When we're told that it was Louisa herself, though, we might have pause for thought. The play concerns a Portuguese revolt of the 1640s, but it's not so much the historical Louisa, Duchess of Braganza, about whom an audience might actually have been expected to know rather little, who's being brought to life, but a particular role that they recognise, the role of the tragic queen that she's fully inhabiting. And of course we're at a further remove. Here we are in a novel being reminded that we are not ourselves present at this performance, and we can't experience, as the heroine does, the tragic catharsis of the suffering queen, except through the heroine's third-person personal narration. Brooke's narrator describes a scene she admits she can't match. The reader needs to have been there, she tells us, to realise the power of the moment. The shared experience of being there is something that can't be reproduced in print, she says. It's necessary, she says, to hear the line pronounced, to have that experience. Nonetheless, Maria is our surrogate for the experience, and it appears that a print fiction, the novel of the Excursion, can give us access to a viewer's affective response from the inside out. So where we are, if you like, is with the viewer, we're experiencing it through her. We're not in 17th century Portugal, but Brooke's novel situates us with Maria, the heroine. Maria is, though, no ordinary heroine. She's also an author and an aspiring playwright. Maria, a theatre-going novice, it's confirmed, was satisfied. Her warmest ideas of theatrical perfection were realised. She was on fire to give her tragedy to the public. So having seen this tragedy, it stimulated her to go out and get her tragedy performed. Just before her trip to the theatre, Maria's reviewed the contents of her portmanteau, which she's brought with her to London. And in that portmanteau she has an epic poem, a novel and a play. She wildly overestimates their value. She thinks she's going to get £100 for the poem, £200 for the novel, and £500 for the play and its copy. Theatre historians and historians of literature have done quite a lot of work on what people actually got paid, and it's nowhere near this kind of amount. Maria's play is, like that of her author Francis Brooke, though, refused by the manager of the patent theatre to which she sends it. So David Garrick refused to put on Francis Brooke's play, just as Maria's play is not put on. And the novel is often read as a kind of satirical attack on David Garrick. We hear nothing about the fortunes of Maria's novel or epic poem, but Francis Brooke, the author, did enjoy considerable success as a novelist and a translator of French fiction in the 1750s and 60s before finding her appreciation as a writer for the stage. She actually had a number of tragedies and operas put on at Covent Garden, and for a brief period managed a theatre herself with Francis Yates. Do you like a handout? So Brooke's career provides a window for me into the interrelated fortunes of the theatre and the novel in the mid-18th century. But of course she's also successful as a novelist about trying to have success in the theatre. We've opened with this scene from a novel describing the immersive experience of a scene from the theatre to place centre stage the preoccupation with art's capacity to invoke presence. Competing claims to presence, I think, fuel the rivalry between the stage play and the novel of this period. And I don't think that rivalry is about competition for scarce resources. It's actually a very productive rivalry that nourishes the development of new techniques and self-consciousness about those techniques in both modes. So I think the theatre also changes as well as the novel. There's a kind of mutual fostering of transformation. In order to demonstrate this case, the following paper gathers evidence about the nature and illusion of presence. And I move from a summary of the ways in which presence has been conceived in aesthetic and generic theory to a discussion of the ways in which mind is imaged between stage and page in the 18th century, to a more specific, and I finish on a more specific exploration of a distinctively 18th century image, which we've already met. That's that image in which an allegorical yet profoundly embodied woman, a fusion of the actress and muse, stalks onto the stage as a kind of image of the present, of this mutually imbricated presence. So I provided you with a handout with the major quotations and references that I use in this paper, and also a page summary of the contents of the monograph that's currently in process on which this paper draws. And your thoughts and responses will help me to make my own performance in that book more effective and present. So I thank you in advance for that. First, though, part two, let's elaborate further about the elusive or allusive or elusive, however you want to think of it, presence, quality of presence. It's a quality that inheres in 18th century theatre and that the aspirant popular form of the novel sought to capture in its own terms. Now, presence is in many ways the antithesis of its near synonym, representation. You can hear the word presence in representation if you think about, and you can certainly see it on the page. Representation represents. Presence is present. Representation communicates meaning. Presence does not communicate. Most helpful in thinking about presence I have found Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht's little book of 2004, The Production of Presence, What Meaning Cannot Convey. Gumbrecht distinguishes between what he calls presence effects and meaning effects. And he sees aesthetic experience as an oscillation, indeed the result of a tension between those two poles. The first quote you have on this handout explains how he is thinking about presence. What is present to us, very much in the sense, he says, of the Latin form prae esse, is in front of us, in reach of, and tangible for our bodies. For Gumbrecht, presence is produced, it's brought forth or pulled forth. So too is presence, does presence work this way for the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy, who he references. Presence is a kind of birthing, coming, being in the birth, being a birth. Existence misses a sense as meaningful sense, says Jean-Luc Nancy. But this missing itself makes sense, and makes sense, our sense, the sense of exposed beings. So there's a contrast here between sense in the sense of meaning and sense in the sense of sensation, feeling. Yeah? Rather than making sense, making meaning, presence occupies the senses. And I think you can also, one of the things I've been thinking about a little bit more recently is think about the idea of pre-sense here, that sense, presence is somehow before sense, or before our sense experience. It's a thing that, if you like, stimulates it, or comes before it. Where meaning unfolds through time, Gumbrecht says, presence produces a spatial relationship to the world and its objects. Gumbrecht draws on Heidegger's concept of being. Being for Heidegger is a tri-dimensional movement in space. There are three dimensions: the vertical, where we occupy a space, where we have sway, physis, nature, standing there on itself. And part of my planned book spends quite a lot of time talking about the sway of the actor, the power of the actor to sway us. The second kind of movement in space is horizontal, the idea, the look, what's seen. You're currently in that horizontal relationship, if you like, to me. And the third movement in space is one of withdrawal what Heidegger calls unconcealment and withdrawal. Of particular importance for our consideration here is the vertical force of sway, described by Gumbrecht as emergent and its result being there. The tragic performance of the actor holds sway over its audience and commands their response, a response that mirrors and closes the space between both parties. But equally, the narrator's invocation of a complete world in a prose fiction, in the novel, promises another and special kind of sway, an immersive capacity to dip into characters' consciousness, that of the narrator, of locale, scene, space, an entire field of knowing. So I'm saying there's sway in both theatre and the novel of a different kind of presence. Now, conversely, the production of presence, or rather the failure to do so, on the 18th century stage is a consistent source of comedy and satire. So I've talked about the tragic sway. I want to look briefly at the way in which there's a fairly, as common as that moment of enraptured sense of immersive presence for a female audience member, is a kind of comic description of how performance fails to communicate presence and real presence. The bodily presence of the actor can inhibit the force of the presence effect of role. So let's have a look at the quote at the bottom here, which comes from Charlotte Charke's comical account. Charlotte Charke is Colley Cibber's daughter. This is an account of a strolling player friend's struggle to deliver a part of a tragic queen again. This is a queen in Dryden's Spanish Friar of 1681. The performance, of course, is in the 1750s. So we have a fairly good-natured actress who's playing the part of the queen. She's lent the actor who's playing her love interest, Torismond, her stockings, because his are full of holes, and his costume requires more display of leg than hers does. So there's only one pair of stockings in this travelling troupe. Having no business with the queen in her part, Charke is playing a colonel called Lorenzo. She's not on stage, so she's watching her from the wings playing this part. Charke was famous for playing cross-dress parts, for playing male parts. I found she spoke sensibly, but to my great surprise observed her to stoop extremely forward, on which I concluded she was seized with a sudden fit of the colic, but she satisfied me of the contrary. And on her next appearance I remarked that she sunk down very much on that side I stood between the scenes, on which I then conjectured her to be troubled with a sciatic pain in her side, and made a second inquiry, but was answered in the negative on that score, upon which I desired to know the reason of her bending forward and sidling so. She told me 'twas a trick she'd got. "'Tis a very new one then," said I, "for I never saw you do so before." But I began to suspect something was the matter and resolved to find it out. Presently the royal dame was obliged to descend from the stage into the dressing room, and made a discovery by the tossing up of her hoop of a pair of naked legs. So here, a superfluity of the bodily concerns of the actor. We might think that sway is all about communicating body. Here, if you like, there's too much body. And that's inhibiting this performance of anything other than sense. All she can do is deliver the sense of the line. She can't get to this moment of presence. The actor's presence undercuts the potential for that other form of histrionic presence that unites actor and audience. While embodiment holds out the promise of presence, then, it can also impede an aesthetic experience of presence. Rehearsal, and I suppose one of the reasons I wanted to just sort of point that out, or raise that, is my sort of sense that we often think that somehow embodiment or the presence of bodies will have more presence than the absence of bodies. And I suppose the contention of the novel is that actually absence of body might provide a more full experience of presence than the presence of body. Okay. Rehearsal, so while embodiment holds out the promise of presence, it can also impede an aesthetic experience of presence. Rehearsal and meta-theatrical stage satires consistently explore this failure of the stage to live up to its promise of sway through presence, reminding the audience of the manufactured nature of the stage fiction. Paradoxically, the presence of the actor and the presence of the real paraphernalia of the stage props, flats, lights. Indeed, the presence of other bodies in the audience risks undermining the spectator's immersion in the fictional real. Gillian Russell notes the ubiquity of the allusion to theatre going to specific plays and performances in Georgian novels, and she concludes from the evidence that an art form and cultural institution that was regarded with suspicion on account of its shameless reliance on presence was often used to enhance the reality effect of these narratives. So novels use references to the stage to enhance their reality effects at the same time as they also participate in this way, this suspicion about a form which is so kind of nakedly reliant on presence. Maria, we should remember, is attending a real performance. Frances Brooks' friend, the actress Mary Ann Yates, is playing the part of Louisa in the stage play in February 1775. Stages and plays become props within the novel that enhance the claim to be representing the now, the novel, the curious, the present, to allow the reader of the novel to be there. While theatrical performance is invoked for these reality effects, conversely, it's often called upon as a negative example of a vulgar species of presence that the novel's aesthetic is diplomatically evading. The absence of body in printed prose fiction comes to be articulated as a means of conjuring real presence, spirit, consciousness, a precious interiority, to which an art form reliant on embodied performance can only gesture. Novels claim a special magic to cross the barrier of skin and flesh on behalf of an audience hungry to inhabit other beings from the inside. And they do so discreetly in the development of a realist style that increasingly tunes out the voice of a narrator. In other words, the novel manufactures being without making visible its workings, the pulleys, the thunder run, the tired costumes, the creak of the sliding flat, so familiar to a knowing theatre audience. So attention, I think, to the importance of theatrical effects as a means to produce affect, situation, point, gesture, music, etc., all of those elements in the stage, all of those theatrical effects, I think, go to shape new practices of narration in the novel. Even whilst it's negating the theatre, I think the novel's also appropriating these elements and transforming them for its own purposes. So it might lead us to enlarge the scope of the novelistic practices we habitually understand to communicate presence. So I think we often think that the presence of the novel lies in its techniques of narration, particularly free and direct discourse, or internal monologue. And that certainly plays an important part in building up this claim to present interiority for a reader of the novel. But those of us who read 18th century novels also know how inconsistent that use of free and direct discourse is in earlier novels by comparison with later works. I think there are other things, direct authorial address to the reader and protagonist, which we might think of as much more like the way that an actor speaks out from the stage to an audience. So direct authorial address, variation in the style and tempo of dialogue and narration, sudden reversals of plots, forms of novelistic narration that overtly imitate dramatic technique. We've tended to overlook these precisely because they appear to belong to the provenance of theatre. Recent accounts of the mutual imbrication of theatre and novel call attention to the ways in which theatricality interrupts novelistic interiority, both to call attention to the manufacturedness of the fiction of mind in prose fiction and to acknowledge the limitations of interiority as a mode of collective political being. I'm thinking here particularly of a rather wonderful book by David Koenig called Empty Houses, Theatrical Failure in the Novel, which is more about, from 2012, it's more about the 19th century novel. But he notes that 19th and 20th century novelists often are attracted to the theatre as a space where you can think about social and collective identity through difference, a kind of mode of being which they find difficult to imagine in the novel form itself. And Widmeyer parallels, in a more close discussion of 18th century theatre in the novel From Ben to Fielding, Widmeyer parallels narratorial irony with those acts of parabasis or direct address to an audience, chorus commentary, actors' asides in the theatre. She says those things we might see as coming from the theatre. There are moments when the fiction of being elsewhere is interrupted and the presentness of theatrical action or narratorial telling is foregrounded. Presence is, of course, often claimed to be the special prerogative of theatre as an art form. Theatre only exists when a spectator is present at an action. So theatre is defined by the presentness of an audience. This is theatre, if you like. Cormac Power, in his book Presence in Play, helpfully distinguishes between different forms of presence in theatre. He says all these forms may exist in any one performance event, but they are different. He distinguishes between what he calls making present, so the fictional representation which unfolds in time before an audience, the story that you see unfolding in time, making present, having present, which he describes as the auratic presence of the actor or the artwork that is in some sense before the audience, the kind of aura of the actor that's put before the audience, and being present, which is the literal contingent co-presence of the actor, the play, and the audience. We can see that Brooke, in that opening incident that I described, is mindful of all three in her novelistic rendering of the ecstatic being there of Maria Villiers. Cormac Power, however, argues not that presence is a special property of theatre, but rather that theatre has the potential to interrogate our experience of the present. Power alerts us throughout his book to the tension in theatre between the world of representation, the neoclassical imperatives of action, time and space, and the claims of performance and liveness. And I think, just to follow on from that a bit, presence should not be confused with liveness in this discussion. Live performance, contingent on the co-presence of performers and audiences, is in some ways irretrievable, even in a world where recording is easy and ubiquitous. So it's kind of beyond representation. The moment that you record a performance, if you like, you've already made that, put it into another kind of, into a kind of absence. It's not present for you. Knowledge of the recording of performance alters or shapes the nature of its live reception. The audience that watches a recorded live performance is by definition a different one from the audience that attends that performance or any other. And it's the live presence of the audience that makes each performance unique and particular. However, there are other ways in which theatrical performance can be understood as an act of making present. So Joseph Roach's Cities of the Dead from 1996 points out that live performance also memorializes lost pasts and produces versions of those pasts. It makes something absent present in the moment of performance. And it's not obvious that theatre has more presence than the novel, despite the liveness that defines it. So the novel, like the play, exists at the moment of its consumption. When you read a novel, you realise the novel. I would question whether it pre-exists that moment of reading in any more of a full sense than a play does. Okay, so the novel comes to life in the mind of its reader. And there's an ongoing tension in both modes, the theatre and the novel, between what Gumbrecht terms presence effects and meaning effects. And it's that which constitutes their aesthetics. And it's worth remembering too that the experience of being present at the action of the play or the novel was evidently not as differentiated in the 18th century as we might have assumed. Novels served as dramatic scripts to be read out loud by household members to each other, and play scripts were purchased by those who were regular theatre-goers and those who were not, to be read quietly and alone. So I'm not saying you read novels on your own and you experience theatre together. There are ways in which they move across these different scenarios. We needn't assume that the reading of a play script in published form among friends and family was always an attempt to recreate the experience of attending a performance of that play, nor that novels were always read by a single and silent reader first before they were shared between a group of readers. Both had and have a presence at the moment of performance and in subsequent performances, whether under new circumstances or not. So I think it should be the object of literary historians to realise those performances of presence as fully and variously as possible. In doing so, we not only come to recognise the hybrid vigour of generic interchange, but also seek to restore the dynamic dependence of literary forms on their realisation in the moment of consumption, when the living consciousness of a reader or an audience member meets the moving form of the artwork. Now, it's arguable that this is itself a kind of chimera, a projected illusion of plenitude in which all those present conspire. So I think it's one reasonable way of countering what I'm saying would be to sort of say, well, this is just a fantasy that these works project, both novel and theatre, fantasize their full presence in these moments of plenitude. It's no accident that this realization is most often invoked in the art form of the novel, the form that lacks that mediating term, the embodied actor who brings a role to life, nor that, as the novel gains in popular sway over the imagination of consumers of fiction, plays start to feature novel readers in their own plots as emblems of these kind of delusional Quixotes, quixotes, who lose a sense of the proportionate tension that ensures fiction is distinguishable from reality. So I'm thinking there of plays like Polly Honeycomb from 1760, or better known to some of you possibly, Richard Sheridan's The Rivals and The Figure of Lydia Languish. Plays which feature novel readers, female novel readers, who can't distinguish between real and fiction. Okay. It might seem that the novel and theatre then, some of what I've said might make us question whether the novel and theatre are thought as separate categories of fiction in this period. Joseph Roach shrewdly observes, he says, the separation of drama from fiction is an arbitrary function of 20th and 21st century academic specialisation, which has for too long enforced a particularly narrow version of purity of genres. Georgian playwrights and novelists, he says, were not simply connected, they were frequently the same person. Certainly by the mid-18th century, both plays and novels were recognised as fictional in the sense that they trafficked in narrative, often invented. Nonetheless, the apparatus whereby fictional images of the real are delivered to mind was part of the mental conception of that mediation. Book and stage communicate very different image schema. While mind is elaborated, the theories of mind in this period is elaborated as a uniform and shared process of translating experience and perception into ideas through the new empirical philosophy, the specificity of the operations of the media that represent mind acquire increasing autonomy and differentiation. So I want to turn next to this idea of the mind as a kind of presence chamber, the mind as itself a sort of theatrical space. The idea of presence is a significant presence in John Locke's account of mind itself. So the idea of presence is a significant player in the late 17th and early 18th century media shift from conceiving of image through visuality and stage to conceiving of image through page and writing. And Locke, of course, is often marked as the kind of key proponent of that shift. In chapter 3 of Simple Ideas of Sense, of his essay concerning human understanding, John Locke describes the brain as the mind's presence room into which senses enter. Enter the primary experiences that form ideas. So this is the first quote. There are some ideas which have admittance only through one sense, which is particularly adapted to receive them. Thus, light and colours, as white, red, yellow, blue, with their several degrees of or shades and mixtures, as green, scarlet, purple, sea green and the rest, come in only by the eyes. All kinds of noises, sounds and tones only by the ears. The several tastes and smells by the nose and palate. And if these organs or the nerves which are the conduits to convey them from without to their audience in the brain, the mind's presence room, as I may so call it, are any of them so disordered as not to perform their functions, they have no postern to be admitted by, no side door, back door to be admitted by, no other way to bring themselves into view and be perceived by the understanding. So the mind's presence room appears to be a form of stage with a number of entrances, each belonging to a sense. The understanding is characterized as an audience brought to perceive each of the senses when they're conveyed to the stage through their various doors. From these senses, the understanding forms ideas which in turn combine to make a higher order of, the mind forms ideas which in turn combine to make a higher order of knowledge, understanding. So we move from gross sense to understanding. There's no postern, a concealed door, often in a fortification for backdoor entrance, if one of the senses is disordered and cannot make its proper entrance. So in this camera obscura of perception, the senses are actors, mediating external phenomena to an audience. This sense of understanding as a form of group mind, perceiving the world in performance in its own auditorium, is a recurrent one, I think, in the fiction of the period, whether on stage or on the page. And the dominance of visuality in the presence chamber of the mind is underlined in Locke's characterization of these sense actors, driven by a compulsion to bring themselves into view. They need to be seen, they need to be put into view. They bring themselves into view for the mind, which is represented here as an absolute ruler to which the senses submit. Mental understanding builds its superior position from the admission of sense data which it organizes. Locke's performance metaphor might appear to be simply a way of figuring how we get from gross sense data to authoritative understanding, but it also reminds us of another important aspect, I think, of presence. That a sense of presence may not entail simply a sense of oneself, it's not simply about subjectivity, but also a sense of the presence of the others, of others. Sorry. Being there entails not only feeling one's own presence at the scene of a performance, but also being with other minds. So if you think about theatre, our sense of presence isn't just our sense of being with the play, it's our sense of being with other people at the play, other minds at the play. To feel present and to feel the presence of others are profoundly interconnected. The actor's presentation of character rests on his or her spatial relation to other characters on stage. The audience's sense of presence rests on feeling themselves alongside others, even though the experience of every member may be different. So you may not be feeling the same, but you are with others. The moments of presence produced through works of art referred to here are not necessarily moments when the consumer of that work feels him or herself to be most alert and conscious of being, but rather when others seem to most fully occupy that consciousness. So there's a kind of paradox here that we feel most present, if you like, when we're most occupied by others, whether that's the performance of the actor or the presence of other audience members. So that moment when others' presence is felt. And it's perhaps unsurprising that supernaturalism is so often the occasion for the sense of others being present or presented to us. Often presence manifests in the form of ghosts and spectres on the 18th century stage and page, leading to the enthusiasm for the Gothic and melodrama in the century's last decades. One of the most recurrent scenes of such presence in the history of 18th century theatre is the opening scenes of William Shakespeare's Hamlet, in which Horatio and Hamlet speak of the tricks of memory that manifest in the mind's eye. Bernardo reports to Horatio sightings on the watch of an armoured figure who looks like the dead king, old Hamlet. The ghost stalks on stage and interrupts Bernardo's account. Horatio concludes a mote it is to trouble the mind's eye. In other words, the portentous figure is an illusion, a speck or spectre conjured by a troubled memory in a time of war. Hamlet returns to Denmark from Wittenberg and expresses his regret that his mother has so swiftly remarried after his father's death, and to his uncle. And Hamlet comments, "My father, methinks I see my father." Horatio asks, "Where, my lord?" To which Hamlet responds, "In my mind's eye," providing Horatio with his opening to report the visitation of the ghost. Now, the scene that stuck in the theatre audience's mind's eye was that of the ghost of old Hamlet appearing to his son. This was associated in particular and for some time with the expressive and affective skills of Shakespeare's recognised champion, the actor David Garrick. The myth that Shakespeare himself had taken the part of old Hamlet only served to further promote Garrick's claims to be reanimating the spirit of England's greatest playwright on his own stage. Theatre is, of course, often a place to memorialise the dead in this way. Emily Hodgson Anderson says, I think very beautifully, theatre is necessarily the space of life where tributes to the past are paid by the living, breathing bodies on stage. And I just want to look at another useful example of this moment, very famous moment, when sort of spectrality and presence come together in a moment of reception in a novel. This is from The True History of Tom Jones, a foundling, 1749, of course written by a playwright turned novelist, Henry Fielding. And here the naive surgeon-servant Partridge accompanies Tom, our hero Tom Jones, to the Drury Lane Theatre to see Garrick play Hamlet. As soon as the play, which was Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, began, Partridge was all attention, nor did he break silence till the entrance of the ghost, upon which he asked Jones, What man that was in the strange dress, something, said he, like what I've seen in a picture. Sure, it's not armour, is it? Jones answered, that's the ghost, to which Partridge replied with a smile, persuade me to that, sir, if you can. Though I can't say I ever actually saw a ghost in my life, yet I'm certain I should know one if I saw him better than that comes to. No, no, sir, ghosts don't appear in such dresses as that. Neither. Now, of course, it's a mistake, because everybody knows that old Hamlet appears in armour. That's a sign of ghostliness. So, in this mistake, which caused much laughter in the neighbourhood of Partridge, he was suffered to continue until the scene between the ghost and Hamlet, when Partridge gave that credit to Mr. Garrick which he denied to Jones, and fell into so violent a trembling that his knees knocked against each other. Jones asked him what was the matter, and whether he was afraid of the warrior on the stage. "Oh, la, sir," said he, "I perceive now. It is what you told me. I'm not afraid of anything, for I know it's but a play, and if it were really a ghost, it could do one no harm at such a distance, and in so much company. And yet if I was frightened, I'm not the only person." "Why, who?" cries Jones. "Dost thou take to be such a coward here beside thyself?" "Nay, you may call me coward if you will, but if that little man there upon the stage is not frightened, I never saw any man frightened in my life. Aye, aye, go along with you. Aye, to be sure. Who's fool then? Will you? Lud have mercy upon such foolhardiness. Whatever happens, it's good enough for you. Follow you, I'd follow the devil as soon. Nay, perhaps it is the devil, for they say he can put on what likeness he pleases. Oh, here he is again. No farther? No, you've gone far enough already. Farther than I'd have gone for all the king's dominions." Jones offered to speak, but Partridge cried, "Hush, hush, dear sir, don't you hear him?" And during the whole speech of the ghost, he sat with his eyes fixed partly on the ghost and partly on Hamlet, and with his mouth open, the same passions which succeeded each other in Hamlet, succeeding likewise in him. There's lots you could say about this passage. I'm sure we could talk about it more. Obviously, one of the things that Fielding does rather brilliantly is turn this kind of tragic scene into a comic one, to make it into a kind of scene of comic dialogue. I'm interested really partly just in that end moment in which we see that Partridge's embodied reaction to Garrick's performance is imitative and gestural. He can't help but mirror the passions of Hamlet as he watches the performance. However, true to Locke's account of mind, perception is only the precondition of understanding, and Partridge is struggling to arrive at this higher order of knowledge. He can perceive, but he can't quite get to understanding. In his exchanges with Tom, he moves in and out of the stage play world, wrestling with his understanding, rather than the purely mechanical perceptual response. This is, though, an understanding not informed by the kind of knowledgeable immersion in theatre that his neighbours in the auditorium signal by laughing at his naivety. He insists that ghosts wouldn't dress in armour because he's not familiar with the iconic representation of spectrality in just this form derived from Shakespeare's play. He insists he knows it's a play, reminds himself that he's at a safe distance from the stage ghost if it were to be a danger to him, but nonetheless communicates his fear as the ghost moves nearer on the forestage. Partridge, we've learned earlier, is deeply superstitious. He's a devout believer in ghosts and fairies. Like Maria Villiers then, and again this is a very significant way in which I think novels nearly always tell a story of that first encounter with theatre. So it was a kind of primary and only encounter. They're most interested in that first moment. So like Maria, Partridge is a novice theatre goer, and he becomes the object of attention for the audience as much as the stage business in which he's so enwrapped. Nonetheless, I think we can't comfortably take the seat of Partridge's neighbours who laugh at him. His response to what is happening on stage before his eyes is the kind of proper audience response. It's immersive and infectious. The novel reader is assumed to be knowledgeable about the stage play world, but may be as disoriented as Partridge is at the theatre in the relatively unmoored territory of the new genre of the novel. So one way to read this moment is to say, is this a way in which the novel is saying what happens for novel readers who aren't familiar with this kind of novel? They might be like Partridge, unfamiliar with a very familiar form of the theatre. To navigate this new world, the world of the novel, the world of the theatre for Partridge, we draw on our knowledges of other forms of fiction. Partridge draws on his knowledge of the supernatural, and our expectations of how plots work themselves out there. In the context, and we might think about the larger frame of Tom Jones here too, in the context of this novel, a fatherless young man on the verge of adult sexuality, Tom Jones, very close to Hamlet, seen as a kind of, in his role in the novel, will achieve a stable marriage and have his parentage recognised, rather than meet the tragic end that awaits Hamlet. reading with innocence, openness, and an appetite for immersion in sensation is a route to successful navigation of the novel as a mode of fiction, as well as a route to happy resolution for the novel's protagonist. That's the kind of moral, ethical way of reading that Tom espouses, that Partridge is modelling, and that we as readers should also be pursuing, presumably. So it's this form of reading, a reading with innocence, openness, and an appetite for immersion in sensation, that Partridge models for the hero and reader alike, albeit the scenes in the theatre demonstrate its impropriety as a form of exegesis when applied to the established genre conventions of the stage play and its performances. Okay. Now, I want to conclude by thinking finally about what I call the aesthetics of real presence. Critics have long recognised the importance of the theatre as the dominant model of the production of reality effects in fictional story to the formation of the novel. The twin facts that novels often draw on plays for their plots and plays increasingly reference novels are widely acknowledged. We have been aware of moments when the theatre's presence, as buildings where increasingly large numbers congregate to watch performances with topical resonance, was purposely suppressed or put into abeyance because of the public risk of riot, from their suppression in the mid-17th century in the Protestant Republic, to the emptying of houses in favour of the scenes of public trial around the Popish plot and exclusion crisis of the late 1670s, to the passing of the Licensing Act in 1737 and the old price riots of 1809. So all I'm saying here is that the recognition that the congregation of large numbers of co-present people is always a risk in theatre. Professional writers for the theatre often turned, of course, to print narrative at precisely those moments when they couldn't maintain an income and sustain their skills because of suppression of the theatre. The book I've just finished drafting then, on which this lecture draws, pays attention to a particular stage in the novel's development, from the passing of the Licensing Act in 1737 to the rise of melodrama in the last decades of the 18th century. In part, it does so because this is a period of theatrical and novelistic history, I think, which is often overlooked and rarely addressed in terms of how the two genres mutually informed each other's development. And where conclusions have been drawn, they tended to be drawn to the novel's advantage. The story has usually been that the Licensing Act sends the drama into decline and catalyses the novel in its place. But I think this is precisely the period in which the two modes enter into dynamic, competitive dialogue with each other. Novels begin to be brought onto stage as props. Their plots and characters are referred to as offstage rivals to those of the stage. Likewise, characters in novels attend the theatre, discuss its affects and effects. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit here. Throughout this lecture, I've sought to find in presence an alternative to the exhausted currency of the language of representation in the literary critical vocabulary. Not least because presence speaks to the now and our mutual participation, where I think representation so often gestures towards the past and to acts of mimesis and diegesis that originate in an individual creative mind. Various terms have been fielded in recent years in literary history to capture the multifarious and multivariant elements that go to make up aesthetic events, and to avoid the familiarity and second-handedness that now attaches to the notion of representation. So we might think about David Worrell's application of the theory of assemblage to the 18th century stage in his book Celebrity, Performance and Reception. Or we might think about notions of mediation developed by Clifford Siskin and William Warner, and this is Enlightenment, to suggest a kind of new vocabulary to capture attention to means of transmission in the production of knowledge, meaning and aesthetic effect. Both of these, I think, are ways of trying to sort of find alternative vocabularies from the language of representation. These important resituations of our critical vocabulary invite the 18th century literary historian to attend to the systemic complexity of artistic practice, to recognise that meaning and effect are not the simple product of a single creative imagination, but rather of collective, sometimes conflicting intentions and agents, human and non-human. While these interventionist resituations have stimulated my thinking, Worrell, Siskin, Warner, I think they often fall short of capturing the aesthetic effects of the rich mutuality of genres in Georgian London. So I'm aiming here to arrive at an understanding of the systemic, if elusive, nature of presence, what Gumbrecht terms the production of presence. And if you remember, producery, he observes, is to bring forth an object in space. Its production is constituted by all kinds of events and processes in which the impact that present objects have on human bodies is being initiated or intensified. Presence, then, for Gumbrecht, is not produced by any one element, but by a combination of them. And the language of bringing forth, I think, is one very familiar to the 18th century characterization of how new forms get invented. And I'll just turn to look at the way that Congreve helps us to think about this. Congreve has the theatre on his mind when he introduced his first and only work of prose fiction to his public in 1692, Incognita, or Love and Duty Reconciled, a novel. Congreve is particularly interesting to me because he starts with a novel and then goes to the theatre, which is a line of development that one doesn't usually expect. Congreve's preface introduces his Incognita in the person of a woman stepping onto a stage and embodying wisdom and art through the medium of her living voice. The drama, he says, is the long extracted from romance and history, 'tis the midwife to industry, and brings forth alive the conceptions of the brain. I think that's a magnificent formulation, that the drama brings forth alive the conceptions of the brain. Minerva walks upon the stage before us, and we are more assured of the real presence of wit when it's delivered viva voce. And he gives a quote from Horace, which I will, rather than read to you in whatever accent Latin might have been delivered in, I'll just read you the translation. They're from Horace's Ars Poetica. What we learn merely through the ear makes less impression upon our minds than what's represented through the trustworthy eye. That's what Horace's quote is about. Since all traditions must, this is still Congreve, since all traditions must indisputably give place to the drama, and since there's no possibility of giving that life to the writing or repetition of a story, sorry, back again, which it has in the action, I resolved in another beauty to imitate dramatic writing, namely in the design, contexture and result of the plot. I have not observed it before in a novel. So Minerva is born from the conception of Jupiter, alive and fully formed from the god's head. How, Congreve asks, can the written form of the novel convey the sense of an animated and living being which the stage imparts through its presentation of embodied persons? Congreve describes the audience's sense of real presence in the actress's speech and gesture as a goddess. This is, I suggest, more than a familiar platitude about embodiment versus print image making. And I think Jacques Rancière, in his Dissensus and a little essay called The Aesthetic Revolution and Its Outcomes, helps us to think a little better about this idea of the sort of displacement of that real presence effects on the mind. He talks about what he calls dissensus, the reordering or reframing or dislocation of sense hierarchy that is the effect of the artwork on its consumer. So the artwork for Rancière dissensuses you. For Rancière, the moment of presence is one of disidentification with the normative hierarchy of the senses, or rather sense identification with the absolute freedom, autonomy and equality of the artwork. Discussing Frederick von Schiller's discussion of a statue known as Juno Ludovico, Rancière asserts that the goddess is such because she wears no trace of will or aim. Obviously, the qualities of the goddess are those of the statue as well. The statue thus comes paradoxically to figure what has not been made, what was never an object of will. In other words, it embodies the qualities of what is not a work of art. Precisely because there's no simple transmission of meaning between shaping creative will and the mind waiting to take its impression, the goddess sculpture promises her audience a simultaneous autonomy and potential of collectivity beyond intention and representation. Rancière goes on to say, the free appearance stands in front of us, unapproachable, unavailable to our knowledge, our aims and desires. The subject is promised the possession of a new world by this figure that he cannot possess in any way. The goddess and the spectator, the free play and the free appearance are caught together in a specific sensorium, cancelling the oppositions of activity and passivity, will and resistance. So for him, the task of aesthetic education is to render ideas perceptible by turning them into living images, creating an equivalent of ancient mythology as the fabric of a common experience shared by the elite and the common people. So from Congreve's first invocation of artistic presence in the person of the goddess of wisdom stalking a stage, to Schiller's Juno, the figure of an affective female, whether idealized or parodized, this figure, the figure of a female of enormous affect, whether idealized or parodied, recurs to mediate, I think, between performance and print experience of presence. Theatre and novel meet, discuss, compete over the bodies of women, as readers or audience members, as actors, in role, and as authors. Women's powers of response and power to provoke response are at the centre of 18th century debates about perception, effect, and performance, in which both theatrical and novelistic sway over impressionable minds were frequently invoked. So there's also an ongoing sort of debate about how impressionable women's minds are, as well as how much women can impress upon a mind. The new phenomenon of the 18th century stage was, of course, the actress and her ever-increasing celebrity. However, writing for the stage was not a means for most women to make a living, as we've seen in the case of Frances Brooke. The institutions of the stage and its management remained fairly exclusively in the hands of men. It's perhaps not surprising that the novel provided a space and place for women to present their agency and call upon the ghostly force of the affective actress. Which brings us back full circle to where we began, with the image of the novel heroine Maria attempting to birth her own playwriting career in an encounter with the material sway of the fully present performance of an actress. Brief code to conclude. I went in October 2017 to see a play at the Orange Tree Theatre, which we've already discussed in one of our workshops. Wonderful play by Brandon Jacobs Jenkins called An Octoroon. It's a play in which reworks an 1859 melodrama by an Irish-American playwright called Dion Boucicault. And that play is about a romance on a Louisiana slave plantation. So Brandon Jenkins takes this play and reworks it and reenacts it as a contemporary black American playwright. And I was very struck. The play opens with the actor-playwright entering and complaining that he's always expected to talk about race. BJJ, an actor, plays the playwright. But that white actors refuse to speak racist lines, so he has to white up to play those parts. The audience comes to realise as the play progresses that the theatre is not about race or the author's idea, but about its audience. So theatre is about the audience's idea of race. If you like, the idea, the presence lies in audience, not in the intention, if you like, or the idea of the author. So Brandon Jacobs Jenkins reminds us that theatre only happens when an audience is present and co-present with the bodies on stage. And that work reminded me of the continuing presence in our modern theatre of Georgian theatre that we looked in our workshop at that sort of the self-awareness of the convention of the prologue in Georgian theatre, in which an actor strides in and represents in surrogate form the author's intention, whilst also recognising the impossibility of the performance realising the author's intention because of an audience's presence. So this is where I want to argue that a self-conscious and kind of co-present reflection on presence is born and sustained. That moment when the novel starts to dialogue with the theatre engenders this energetic and live conversation about what about what kind of presence art constitutes. So I will stop there and invite thoughts. Thank you.